Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jennifer, and I'm the Director of Research and Communications at the Endowment for Middle East Truth. Today, we're going to be discussing the horrific Islamic terrorist attack in Orlando on June 12th, which was the second largest terror attack to occur on U.S. soil, killing 49 people and wounding another 50. The terrorist who carried out the attack, Omar Mateen, was a U.S. citizen who had declared his allegiance to ISIS. We later learned that Mateen had been the subject of investigations by the FBI in 2013 and 2014, but both cases were dropped. This attack leaves us with many questions about the competence of the law enforcement community, the growing threat of radical Islam and ISIS in the United States, among other issues. We're pleased to have with us today Kyle Shideler to discuss the attack, explore some of these questions, and more. Kyle Shideler is the Director of the Threat Information Office at the Center for Security Policy. Kyle has previously served as the Director of Research and Communications for the Endowment for Middle East Truth and the Senior Researcher and Public Information Officer for several organizations working in the field of the Middle East and terrorism policies since 2006. Kyle is a contributing author to Saudi Arabia and the Global Islamic Threat Network, America and the West's Fatal Embrace, and has written for numerous publications as well as briefed legislative aides, intelligence and law enforcement officials, and the general public on national security issues with a focus on Islamist movements and jihadist ideology. And without further ado, Kyle, thanks so much for joining us today, and feel free to begin.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's my pleasure to talk to you all today. Whenever I get a chance to brief the folks that Emmett brings together, I always kind of feel like I'm going home a little bit. So it's my pleasure. As Jennifer said, my name is Kyle Shideler. I am the Director of the Threat Information Office at the Center for Security Policy, which is where I focus on researching and investigating foreign and domestic Islamic movements that engage in or support jihad against the United States. The threat in Threat Information Office comes from the concept of threat doctrine analysis, which is one of the first responsibilities of an intelligence analyst, and that's to understand the enemy threat doctrine, the ideas or the ideology which motivates them and informs their actions, and then to hopefully use the analysis of the threat doctrine in order to predict the enemy's actions and to prevent surprise, the kind of surprise that was not prevented in the case of the Orlando attack. So it's through that rubric which I'm going to be kind of looking at this incident. I want to begin by walking through the timeline of events leading up to the attack, then discuss the significance of the attack itself, maybe talk a little bit about how it's comparable or different to other recent attacks, and then maybe touch somewhat on the Obama administration's response to the attack if there's time. I know Jennifer will grab the hook and pull me off if I'm stepping too much into question and answer period time, so feel free to do that, Jennifer. So let's begin with the question of trying to pin down Omar Mateen's history and really answer this question: when was the Orlando shooter indoctrinated? Notice I didn't say radicalized, but indoctrinated, and there's a distinction there that we'll get to. But let's begin by looking at the father. We know that the father, Sadiq Mateen, came to the United States from Afghanistan in the 1980s, where, according to sources, he had been with the Afghan Mujahideen. Now, this would have been pre-Taliban. We know that the father would serve as director and vice president of the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce, and he ran a satellite television show where, among other curious statements he made, he referred to the Taliban at one point as our warrior brothers. So an interesting background there. We know that on 9/11, Omar Mateen, who would have been 14 years old at the time, reportedly cheered the attacks, which would cause disagreements and fights with other students he was with at the time. We know that Mateen attended his father's mosque at the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce for at least a dozen years, attending as often as 4 times a day. Mateen went to work for G4S Security in 2007, where he would have passed a background check, and we know that he did. In 2013, the FBI begins to investigate Mateen for the first time. Now, this occurs after coworkers reported that Mateen had expressed ties to al-Qaeda, specifically family ties. He had made statements about the Boston Marathon bombers, and also he reportedly said that he had ties to or was a member of Hezbollah. Now, according to reports, the FBI undertakes about a 10-month investigation, during which time they do place him on the terror watch list, as well as under surveillance, and they introduce a number of informants into his life, all in an attempt to figure out what they can about Omar Mateen. Now, this investigation is ultimately canceled, reportedly in part because the FBI considered Mateen to be essentially an ignorant poser. And they do this at least partially because they look at his statement of support by these two groups, namely Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, and the FBI says, well, these are diametrically opposed groups. They're currently fighting each other. It doesn't make sense that if he was a real jihadist, he would make statements supporting both these groups. So that's part of the FBI's reasoning, and the other part comes from Mateen telling the FBI during interviews that he only made these comments in order to annoy his coworkers because they had been discriminating against him. So it appears that the FBI sort of took these claims of Islamophobia on the part of Mateen's colleagues at face value. So this is 2013, and by the way, 2013 is when we begin to get the first reports from club goers at the eventual site of the attack, Pulse Nightclub, where they say they had begun seeing Mateen at the club at least beginning in 2013. So about the same time he's under investigation by the FBI, we also can place him at the club. Now, this is of interest to me because his appearance at this club has been repeatedly cited by those analyzing the attack from a metric trying to associate this more as, for example, an individual with some kind of repressed homosexual desire who had then attacked the nightclub out of some kind of misplaced homophobia. And that's sort of where that narrative begins, is during these 2013 appearances at the club. My question would be, if we are already looking at the FBI investigating him at this point, is it not possible that he was conducting surveillance on the club as early as that point? And we don't know the answer to that yet. So again, in 2014, his coworkers are once again reporting that Mateen is making statements expressing hatred and calling for violence against a wide variety of groups, including homosexuals, Jews, African Americans, and women. Mateen's coworkers claim that they spoke to the company, it's G4S Security, who in turn declined to take action against Mateen, and the workers say that they believe that the company did that because of essentially political correctness. Now, this is about the same time that Mateen's connection to al-Nusra Front suicide bomber Mohammad Abu Salah appears, and his connection to the suicide bomber. Abu Salah detonated a suicide bomb in Syria on behalf of al-Nusra Front. And so his connection to Mateen will reintroduce the FBI into his life. Now, we are seeing Fox News reporting that Mateen's connection to Abu Salah may be far more complex than was originally reported. It was sort of originally reported that Abu Salah and Mateen had met each other, were aware of each other, and were in contact. And so the FBI once again starts taking another look at Mateen. And this is in 2014. Interesting to know, Abu Salah also attended the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce, which again I'll remind you is where Mateen's father was actually employed as vice president. So we have this connection between Mateen and the mosque and Abu Salah, and the mosque, and between Mateen and Abu Salah. So we have all these three connections during 2014, and he's once again being looked at by the FBI. So the FBI once again makes the decision to clear Mateen, despite the fact that he was reportedly looking at videos of Muslim Brotherhood / al-Qaeda cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. This is relevant, of course, because Anwar al-Awlaki, the al-Qaeda cleric from Yemen, who we killed in a drone strike, has been the ideological influence for a number of domestic terror attacks in the United States, including Fort Hood, the Boston bombing, the attack by the Chattanooga shooter on the recruiting center, and a number of other attacks as well. So, San Bernardino as well. So Anwar al-Awlaki is an individual that the FBI is well aware of, that focusing in on his videos and searching for and looking for his videos is clearly a high point for a potential threat. Now, moving forward to the months actually leading up to the attack itself, Mateen begins to conduct operational surveillance on both the Pulse Nightclub, which becomes his eventual target, as well as a number of Disney properties. And that began at least as early as April of this year. We know, according to reports, that his wife was with him while they conducted surveillance, and that his wife was aware that he was purchasing a holster for a firearm as well as other equipment that he would eventually end up using in the attack. Just weeks before the attack, he will purchase around $9,000 in jewelry from Kay's Jewelers. He'll attempt to purchase body armor and a bulk ammo purchase at a gun store, but be denied. Now, this is an interesting report because we know the gun store clerk reports that they denied Mateen his request, and he then promptly made a phone call where he spoke to an unknown individual in a foreign language for some time. And that's according to the gun store clerk. We don't know who he was talking to at this point, but obviously it raises questions as to whether Mateen was in contact with any other individual who knew about the plot, who was facilitating in helping him acquire material or telling him what sorts of materials to acquire. So that will obviously become an avenue for investigation in the future, one will hope. We do know that in the weeks leading up to the attack, Mateen sells his interest in his condo to his sister and his brother-in-law for $10. So now we know in hindsight, of course, as we look at it, that one can see a classic pattern of terrorist activity. We have the surveillance, both general and then specific, which means to say that we have a general scouting of potential targets, followed by a selection of a specific target and additional surveillance of that specific target. We have the next step of acquiring logistics, including the firearms, seeking out body armor, bulk ammo, holsters, and other equipment. And then we have, in the weeks leading up, the preparation for martyrdom. We see Mateen ridding himself of his debts, including whatever he owes on the condo by getting rid of his interest in the condo, and, of course, acquiring the jewelry. Now, the purchase of the jewelry is interesting to me because I'm looking at it from two perspectives. On the one side, was he attempting to acquire this jewelry in order to support his wife and children, who he knew would be, orphaned when he was martyred, and having the jewelry, which hopefully will be, or hopefully in his case, would be, a investment that would be difficult by the FBI to find and seize after his incident. Or it's also possible that a number of Islamic State supporters have sold off their assets and transferred it to the Islamic State prior to attacks. It is possible, I suppose, and we'll learn about this in the future, that he invested this $9,000 in jewelry in order to transfer it to the Islamic State, where it could then be used on behalf of the caliphate, which he will eventually swear allegiance to. So Mateen launches his attack, the details of which I probably don't need to go into, except to say that he made separate calls to both his wife and to 911. We know that when speaking to 911, he declares allegiance to the Caliph of the Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He reportedly also made reference to that al-Nusra suicide bomber, Abu Salah, and possibly also to the Boston Marathon bombers, the Tsarnaev brothers. Of course, there's some hubbub about that transcript right now because some of you are probably aware the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, said that the FBI would only release a partial transcript of that conversation, and that, in fact, has recently been released where almost inexplicably they include some of the conversation including his statement of allegiance, only to omit the words Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Islamic State, as if nobody at this point can figure out who it is he may have been talking about. It's a little bit ridiculous, and it's kind of a cow already out the barn door behavior that we've seen from the Obama administration elsewhere, and we can talk about that in a little bit. One point I want to get into, which does not fit on the timeline because we don't know precisely when it is alleged to have occurred, is the report from Fox News that Mateen was a student of a man named Marcus Dwayne Robertson, a.k.a. Abu Tauba. Now, Abu Tauba, as he's better known, is an African-American Muslim with a long history of as a pro-jihadist cleric. We know he once robbed banks as a member of the Alibaba and the 40 Thieves gang in New York, and he did that in order to raise funds for jihad. At about this same time, he was also a bodyguard for the blind sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who was responsible for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Robertson, a.k.a. Abu Tauba, has denied that Mateen was a student of his, and it is not clear whether he is under any kind of investigation. But Robertson has a long history of indoctrinating dozens of individuals to jihad, and
go ahead, Kyle.
Keep him in seclusion during his time, he was recently released. So that's kind of a rundown of the Orlando shooter and the timeline. So how does this compare or contrast to other recent attacks? So to begin with, we have ties to local mosques or domestic Islamic organizations, in this case the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce, where Omar Mateen's father was vice president. We have seen this in other cases. San Bernardino, we know the shooters attended the Islamic Center of Riverside. The Philadelphia police shooting, the shooter attended Masjid Mujahideen. In Chattanooga, it was the Islamic Society of Greater Chattanooga. We also had jihadists attempting to travel to support Islamic State with ties to the Islamic Society of Mississippi. And in all these, and the reason I point this out is because in all cases, we don't have small or radical or unknown fly-by-night clerics and mosques. We have fully established, well-built, well-attended mosques and Islamic organizations that are completely integrated into the Muslim community in the United States. Secondly, in most cases, they have either direct connections or at least a limited connection to the Muslim Brotherhood network in the United States. I can go over the specifics on each of the mosques that I mentioned as to what those were, but in every case, there is at least some connection. So the reason I point that out is because this is obviously problematic from the narrative of a lone wolf or a lone radicalized individual who has no other contacts with the rest of the community at large. Secondly, we've got a situation where in each attack, each of those attacks or incidents that I mentioned, very difficult to argue that at least some members of the family were unaware of the situation ahead of time, and yet they made no report. And obviously, in the Orlando shooting case, we have the wife who was clearly with him during surveillance, who was aware of logistical efforts to acquire items such as holsters and other equipment which would end up being used in the attack. We have the sale of the house to the brother-in-law, which must have, if you're unaware of Mateen's intentions, must have seemed strange at the time. And just the general behavior at work by Mateen is also suggestive that if he's acting out this way at work, it would be very hard to argue that no members of the family were aware of his behavior. We saw similar incidents in San Bernardino, where the mother of the male shooter, he lived with his mother. They were building pipe bombs in her garage, yet somehow she had no idea what was going on. So some key issues to look at in terms of what we can learn from this incident. One is sort of the failure of the FBI to utilize proper ideological doctrine, or a miseducation by the FBI on doctrine. So we have, for example, this kind of misguided view by the FBI as to how jihadist terror groups actually interact and cooperate. For example, considering al-Qaeda and Hezbollah as organizations which are contrary to each other and would never coexist or cooperate. Well, as it happens, we know for a fact that it was Hezbollah that instructed al-Qaeda in how to conduct truck bombings in the 1990s, and Hezbollah facilitated the travel of several 9/11 hijackers from Afghanistan to Saudi Arabia with the assistance of Hezbollah big shot Imad Munir. So we know, in fact, that Shiite terror groups and Sunni terror groups will cooperate against a larger Western target. And just considering, for example, dismissing Mateen's claim simply because he's a Sunni and Hezbollah is Shiite. Well, Samir Kuntar, a high-level Hezbollah operative that Israel struck and killed in Syria, is not even Muslim at all. In fact, he's a Druze, or was a Druze, I should say, before the Israelis took him out. So clearly there's a misunderstanding here, or a willful blindness as to the actual level of cooperation between terrorist organizations. We see this again after the attack with FBI Director Comey's statements, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, where he discussed how the shooter, Mateen, had made statements in praise of both al-Qaeda under the Boston Marathon bombings, as well as Islamic State, and how his friend Abu Salah had ties to al-Nusra. And there's sort of this idea that, well, al-Qaeda as al-Nusra Front in Syria and Islamic State don't get along. Therefore, no Islamic State supporter could possibly cooperate or assist or praise these sorts of jihad attacks. And we know that this is simply untrue. If you look at, for example, the Charlie Hebdo shooting, the Kouachi brothers who attacked the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, France, yelled, "This is for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula," as they conducted their attack. But at the same time, Ahmed Koulibaly, who attacked the kosher supermarket, conducted his attack in the name of the Islamic State, but he did it in order to coordinate with and assist the Kouachi brothers during their manhunt by French police. So here you have cooperation, two individuals who knew each other, were both members of the same jihadist network, but who ended up joining, in the one case, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and in the other case, Islamic State. To say that such cooperation doesn't happen is simply erroneous. It does happen. And so the FBI's idea that they're going to use group membership as a reason to dismiss jihadist statements is, in my view, a pretty serious error. Then we have the significance of the attack on the nightclub itself. We saw in the press a law enforcement source who said that the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Florida had simply no idea that homosexual nightclubs would be a potential target for terror attacks. He said, I'm paraphrasing here, it simply hadn't occurred to them. That's highly problematic. Any good law enforcement officer who had received proper training in jihadist doctrine would know, obviously, homosexuality is viewed as completely haram and unacceptable, and that under Sharia law, homosexuals can be killed. And in fact, this support for the death penalty for homosexuals is actually seen across the board amongst Muslim American community imams and preachers that are considered moderate by our government, and I include Muslim Brotherhood individuals in that, where they have preached in support of the death penalty for homosexuals. So here's an example where having better knowledge of doctrine and a better knowledge of ideology would have played a role in helping prevent attacks. The other thing to note here is that the attack on the nightclub, while obviously an attack on homosexuals, is not solely that. It is also an attack on Western culture more broadly. If we look at the statement by Islamic State in support of the attack, they note that this was an attack on the, quote, crusaders, in the form of an attack on the followers of Lot, which is a phrase commonly used in Islamic jurisprudence to refer to God's destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and homosexuals described as followers of Lot. So this is how Islamic State and other jihadists kind of view homosexuality as not just a front in itself and haram in and of itself, but also representative of the negative influence that Western culture has on the Muslim community, and therefore the West's tolerance of homosexuality is in and of itself a threat to Islam and therefore must be dealt with. I do want to talk a little bit about the concept of lone wolves, or this notion of lone wolf terrorism, and how it's really kind of proving itself to be a useless model in terms of looking at terrorism. The reality is that most of the incidents we're seeing, the attackers are, if anything, and I will credit my friend Patrick Poole for this term, they're known wolves, which is to say that they are attackers who were known or already previously under investigation and yet were still successful. So this idea that there are individuals who are essentially undetectable because they are not in communication with anyone and no one knows of their tendencies or plans is simply incorrect. That just doesn't seem to happen. A more accurate model is the so-called wolf den model, where these individuals have other conspirators, they have partners, they have networks that assist in ideological indoctrination, they assist in logistics, they assist in sort of egging people to get up the courage to take action, even if they don't, in fact, take part in the attack itself. So the lone wolf model really kind of discredited, I think, at this point. And the last thing I want to get into a little bit is the radicalization concept, and I said I would talk about this in the beginning. And in my view, the radicalization concept, which is really the du jour preferred talking point of the Obama administration and the basis for the countering violent extremism policy and concept, is essentially useless. This view of individuals who are self-radicalized is an oxymoron. For example, how does one, if one is not already supportive of Anwar al-Awlaki's message, how does one go out onto the internet and find those videos in order to watch them? Unless somebody is strapping you to a chair, Clockwork Orange style, and forcing you to watch al-Qaeda videos against your will, you must have already been indoctrinated to a certain level to seek that material out. So this sort of radicalized on the internet concept is essentially nonsense in my view. So when then was Mateen, quote unquote, radicalized? When did his indoctrination begin? Would you argue that it is at the age of 14, where he was already praising al-Qaeda attacks on the United States that killed 3,000 people? Was he only radicalized after watching the Anwar al-Awlaki videos? As I said, if he had to have been essentially indoctrinated in order to seek them out to begin with. So if we view it through this lens of indoctrination, it creates a different view than the radicalization view, which is indoctrination says there is a doctrine that pre-exists the individual to which they are being introduced and educated, right? And that this is a process that takes time and is done through steps, right? And so this, in my view, is a better way of looking at these sorts of situations. And so I would argue that Mateen's indoctrination process has already begun by the time he is 14 and is praising the 9/11 attacks. So instead of looking for a specific moment in time, a when was he radicalized question. You're asking, when did his indoctrination begin? How did he move through that process? When did he reach different steps in this process? Which is to say, when was he an Islamist? When was he devoted to the concept of political Islam and Sharia rule over U.S. constitutional rule? When did he reach the stage where he viewed it necessary to engage in jihad against the West, and so on? And this view of stages of a process of indoctrination is actually more in line with jihadist and Islamist doctrine, guys like Sayyid Qutb, who talk about the milestones and the progressive revelation through which individuals and society move in order to become more adherent Muslims and eventually to process to a point where they can wage jihad on behalf of Allah and establish the Sharia. So this is, I think, a more effective model at looking at how individuals become jihadists. Unfortunately, as I said, that is not a view that is favored by the Obama administration. The Obama administration very much favors this sort of radicalization on the internet view because it takes away agency from those parties which are participating in bringing attackers along this process. So, in my view, this incorrect focus on radicalization, this incorrect focus on countering violent extremism, where one is relying on the community, the Muslim community or the Muslim families to turn in quote-unquote extremists, is sort of bound to fail. So that's one of these questions that we don't have an answer to as yet. Obviously, we have at this point now 2 confirmed jihadists from the same area mosque, which Mateen's father helped run. We know, even looking at the father's statements post-shooting, he is continuing to make statements about homosexuality, about how that should be dealt with in society, that are essentially at odds with classical American culture, let's say. So he is made statements about how homosexuals should be punished by God, not by men. So one can certainly see at least strains of thinking that would have moved Mateen along in this process, even if it was not the father who encouraged the physical act of terror itself. Clearly, he was moving Mateen along a continuum. I'm hopeful that there will be continued investigation into the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce itself, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it. We'll see. The mosque itself actually denied even knowing the shooter, saying that he never went there and they didn't know he was and they'd never really heard of him, et cetera, et cetera. And as far as I know, no media has ever called them on the fact that they claim to have not known the shooter, yet the shooter's father was the vice president of the mosque. So clearly you're seeing in their response post-attack more of an effort to minimize their exposure than really get to the bottom of what happened. That's an excellent question. So we do know that both Islamic State and other terrorist organizations have called for attacks on Ramadan. That is very common. And we do, in fact, usually see an uptick in attacks during Ramadan. This is a period where all members of the Muslim faith are being called to better adherence. And so if one is moved further along on this timeline of indoctrination, one might expect a similar reaction. So one may expect that if one was a potential jihadist, the time of Ramadan and the call for attacks during Ramadan may be particularly attractive. As it relates to July the 4th, I am genuinely skeptical of the view that jihadists target victims for or on dates significant to the victim. When we've seen incidents that were matched by date, there was a tendency, or there is a tendency, to have them tied to dates that are significant not to the victim but to the attacker. For example, prior to 9/11, there were very few people that considered September 11th significant in any way, but for a student of Islamic history, the siege at Vienna and the failure of that effort by the jihad would be a memorable date, for example. The one thing that makes July 4th significant then is not so much that it is a Independence Day holiday for us, but rather that there are attractive targets coming out during that period. You've got people getting together, you've got parades, you've got soft targets, concerts, these sorts of things taking place during that time. So the fact that we have Ramadan and its effect, as I mentioned, coinciding with this holiday on our part, which leads to more potential targets becoming available, that I would say makes it attractive, but it's not the specific element of it being July 4th itself as such, if that makes sense. That is a really good question. We do know that Latinos have been a targeted population for dawah, which is to say preaching and proselytizing, and specifically by Muslim Brotherhood-linked groups like Islamic Circle of North America, which the questioner added. I am inclined to believe it will probably not create a rift. For that matter, I don't expect a rift between the Muslim community or the wider left and the LGBT community either. I expect that the narrative, which is supported by both Islamist groups and hard left groups, that this is a question of gun control, not a question of jihadist terrorism, will be successful for these targeted populations. So I think that while it may be possible to convince some people at the edges, I don't expect that we're going to see big shifts in any direction. So I'd like to make a distinction between individuals and community organizations. So let's for a moment kind of talk about just individuals. It would obviously be of value, and has in fact been of value, the FBI has said, to have individual Muslims who report incidents that they consider suspicious, and we know that they have in fact done so, to report family members that are becoming indoctrinated or are becoming threats, and we know that's happened to some extent, to serve as informants and sources for law enforcement and intelligence, and we know that does happen at some level. On the other side, if one is talking about community organizations, organizations which purport to represent the Muslim community as a whole, I am highly skeptical about these organizations having any real value to play in law enforcement. For starters, because the vast majority of them are affiliated with and or controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, which means that they are essentially involved in the jihadist indoctrination process and support for jihad, including financial support. That is their purpose. And so it is highly unlikely that they have any real interest in assisting law enforcement in preventing terror attacks. We know For example, that the Council on American Islamic Relations continues to push a campaign urging American Muslims not to speak to the FBI. So they are, in fact, the organized Muslim community, as represented by the Brotherhood, works against the kind of interaction that is actually useful law enforcement, which is to say individual Muslim Americans who may have something to reporting it. I would say that the big failure of countering violent extremism has been that it empowers these organizations to represent all Muslim Americans, as if the Muslim Brotherhood is somehow the constituent service for all Muslims everywhere. I think that's a mistake, and it actually inhibits conducting, actual interviews, actual interrogations, acquiring real informants, getting real sources on the ground from people that genuinely want to help, instead of organizations that are solely advancing their own interests and are not interested in assisting law enforcement. So I would say that a move by law enforcement to return to a law enforcement intelligence-based program which targets specific people that may have information and tries to get information from them is a positive. A policy of propping up community organizations as the sole representatives of the Muslim community is a mistake. So, as I suspect most people on the call are aware, in 2009, the Obama administration undertook an effort to prohibit and to essentially cleanse the training curriculum of, at first, the FBI and eventually all law enforcement, intelligence, and defense agencies of doctrinal information about the kind of wider threat. So any notion of Sharia, any notion of jihad as such essentially was suppressed. And we're still seeing the effects of that today, where, as I mentioned, FBI agents are making some pretty serious errors about how they treat the interaction between terrorist organizations. All of that comes out of a lack of knowledge of doctrine. So, and the Obama administration has doubled down on that policy. We can see that with this transcript issue, omitting specific names of individuals that are, in fact, have already been reported. And we're talking about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the Caliph of Islamic State. It has already been reported that Mateen swore allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So there's no reason to omit it. It's nonsensical. I think the notion of the administration is that somehow this prevents some kind of propaganda coup by the Islamic State, which just goes to show you the problem with countering violent extremism, where they are more focused on social media messaging than they are on preventing attacks. It's all about, how do we frame this? What's the narrative? Not how do we figure out who the bad guys are and how do we stop them. So as long as we have this focus that says what we need to do is send out more tweets and not recruit more sources and not gather more intelligence and not stop more plots, we're going to be vulnerable. Well, we already know, as one of the questioners pointed out, that Islamic State has called for attacks during Ramadan. It's during Ramadan. Omar Mateen carried out an attack as instructed. It's this idea that the only way one can serve or represent a terrorist organization is by having filled out the appropriate paperwork in triplicate and submitted one's request for Al-Qaeda health insurance is simply nonsense. The Islamic State has called for attacks. Omar Mateen answered that call. That is sufficient. That is all we need to know in order to recognize that Omar Mateen was a supporter and acted on behalf of the Islamic State. Now, that said, how was he indoctrinated and by whom? the idea that just because he carried out the attack on behalf of the Islamic State doesn't mean he was indoctrinated by the Islamic State. And I think that's an important distinction. Someone else very well may have carried out that process. I believe they did. And I believe it took place domestically, as the FBI has said. So I don't believe that there was some individual from al-Qaeda or Islamic State that was reaching back to Omar Mateen into his youth in order to convince him to attack Western culture and the American way of life. Quite the opposite. He was raised domestically by domestic Muslim American organizations, and at some point he was under this process of indoctrination. Whether that was Abu Tauba, as Fox News suggested it may be, whether that took place at the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce, or, which I think is most likely, if it was some combination of the above, that's a domestic indoctrination. But this is we've seen this again and again with terror attacks. Individuals who have been raised their entire lives within the Muslim Brotherhood organizations, worked at MSAs, or were members of MSAs in college, joined groups like CARE, for example, only to go on to either support or engage in jihad abroad. And I'm thinking in this case of folks like Ismail Royer, who was at CARE National before being convicted of supporting Lashkar-e-Taiba, a Pakistani jihadist organization that fights India and Kashmir, and conducted the Mumbai attacks. Is there a direct link between a brotherhood organization like CARE and Lashkar-e-Taiba? No, probably not. They don't have to be having conversations on Twitter between themselves as to how to get this particular individual from point A to point B. The job of organizations like the Brotherhood is to indoctrinate people to jihad. The job of jihadist organizations is to wage jihad. Which jihadist organization the recruit joins is essentially immaterial. That's almost irrelevant. Probably would a Brotherhood organization prefer somebody join al-Qaeda over Islamic State? I suspect they probably would. Or to support Hamas instead of Islamic State? They probably would. But ultimately, the machinery of indoctrination is doing what it was set out to do. And that doesn't require a specific command and control, because there is a larger doctrine at play of which they are both members and they're both aware, which is just to say that they are both Islamists, they are both ultimately jihadists, and so they are filling their roles in this movement that doesn't require prior coordination between the two. So one may recall a while back a handful of congressmen making an effort to ask some pretty serious questions of inspector generals of the various departments as to how certain individuals with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood acquired security clearances and other access. You may recall that did not end particularly well for the 5 congressmen and women who undertook that effort. They were denounced on the floor of the Senate by one of their own colleagues, amongst other things. So I would say in part that's because there is no unity amongst the Republican Party, which holds the House and Senate, on this issue. We've seen the same thing with the Muslim Brotherhood designation bill, where despite having pretty decent support among at least elements of the party in the House, the Republican Party in the House, and even some bipartisan support for that matter from some House Democrats, it cannot get, and having successfully passed a committee, by the way, it simply can't get a hearing because the House leadership does not wish it to take the floor, probably because they don't want to be forced to vote for it. They don't want to vote for it, and they don't want to be forced to vote against it. Why is that? That is a good question. I think in part it's because elements of leadership of both parties genuinely believe in this idea that Islamist organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood are helpful. In fact, we've had that specific response from some staffers. These were actually pro pro-designation staffers, but they said, we're hearing from our colleagues, well, if we pass this bill, we can't talk to people or work with people that we need to work with. And so obviously that's highly problematic, but that's part of the reason. Obviously the other part is those who mention this issue tend to be painted in a very bad light, and there are very few in Congress that are willing to risk their political capital on that. So I would start with reintroducing proper doctrinal education into law enforcement and intelligence officials. This can be done. The folks that were doing it prior to the purge still exist, and they would be happy to do it again if they were invited to do so. Of course, that's only one step, but it would be a necessary step. Any step that didn't include that is bound for failure. Then I think we would need a Congress and administration to push back on certain elements that have neutered intelligence gathering and law enforcement activities, and I'm speaking specifically of Brotherhood and hard left organizations that have directly targeted the use of informants. We've had even groups like CARE put out bounties for information on federal informants, which in any normal society one would have expected to cause an outrage. It's a direct interference with law enforcement activities, but they've done things like that. Targeting electronic surveillance, which can be useful if brought into the hands of people who know what to do with it, which goes back to the training issue. So if it was up to me, I would want more law enforcement training. I would want more officers capable of finding and recruiting informants and placing informants in actual areas where they are liable to get information, which means mosques, which means Islamic centers and other organizations that are controlled by the Brotherhood. I would return to a focus on targeting terror finance in order to take out or otherwise hinder these organizations. I'm thinking in this case of, for example, like the 2008 Holy Land trial, where it had a tremendous impact on the Brotherhood organizations. If we were to reinstitute that kind of intelligence and law enforcement activity, I think you would see the brothers creep back into their holes a little bit out of concern that they would be caught. There was a recent article in the Bloomberg by Eli Lake a couple months ago, I think, that pointed out that there have been essentially no Islamic charities prosecuted for terror finance since the Holy Land Foundation, essentially. So there's that would be one place. So we're talking about targeting, using terror finance as a way to target the organizations that are engaged in indoctrination, rather than this sort of effort at playing whack-a-mole and targeting individual who may or may not go jihadist at any given point. And that becomes the issue. So if you're tracking just Islamic State sympathizers, first of all, there are thousands of them. We know that. Second of all, if they're not engaged in jihadist activity or support for jihadist activity during the time that you can afford to spend monitoring them. And for example, the FBI was 10 months in 2013 on Omar Mateen that they had surveillance, that they were working informants, that they were conducting interviews, but nothing paid off in that 10 months. So if you're just chasing around the individuals, you're going to have a lot more cases like that. Whereas if you're targeting the indoctrinators, the individuals engaged in that activity, there are one, less of them, and two, you're trying to cut off at the knees the recruitment of more and more of these individuals, right? So that would, I guess, be my view. As long as we're focused on this sort of whack-a-mole policy, we cannot be successful.